We all seek to be compassionate and helpful people, don't we? An older couple were cleaning the kitchen after dinner one evening when suddenly the woman felt lightheaded and passed out on the floor. And her husband quickly called 911 and requested an ambulance. The emergency operator asked, "What is your address?" And he said, 1725 Eucalyptus Avenue. She said, "Can you spell that, sir?" And there was a brief pause, and he said, "No, but if you'll give me a minute, I can carry her over to Oak Street." Compassion is not always easy, nor is it convenient. Earlier, we heard the biblical story of Jesus feeding the multitudes. It is filled with life lessons about faithfulness and compassion. This story is the only one of Jesus' Galilean miracle stories that appears in all four of the Gospels. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John all tell this story, and they give their own varying details of this event in which Jesus takes the lunch of one young boy and feeds a very large crowd. And the story beyond what we heard earlier today, we learn that not only was everyone fed, but that there was excess food to be gathered by the disciples. If you read the different gospel renderings of this story, we see some unique aspects. For example, Mark and Luke tell of Jesus putting the responsibility for feeding the crowd squarely in the hands of the disciples. They don't need to go away. You give them something to eat. Now, what precedes this miracle story is very important. Jesus had just received word that John the Baptist, who had been beheaded in prison by the order of King Herod. John the Baptist was so important to Jesus. It was he who initiated Jesus' ministry by preaching forgiveness, repentance and forgiveness. He was the one who had baptized Jesus to initiate his earthly ministry. So Jesus was deeply grieved, and he was seeking to be alone. And as we heard in the story, Jesus said to his disciples, "Let's go to a remote place on the other side of the lake so we can have time alone and so you can rest." Now in Mark's gospel, which is the earliest account, Jesus makes no reference to where the disciples got their loaves and fishes. In fact, neither does Matthew or Luke. But it is John, whose gospel was written much later, who tells us that it was a boy who willingly gave up his lunch on that day. And I'm glad John included that part of the story. For I really doubt that the boy had any idea that he would play a significant role on that day. Rather, probably his mother said to him something like, "Yes, you can go, as long as you wash behind your ears and wear your good church sandals, and oh, here, take this lunch in case the preacher's long-winded." It is worth noting that this event that concluded with a bunch of leftovers was not on Jesus' itinerary for the day. Rather, Jesus wanted to be alone, so he took the boat to what was supposed to be a quiet place, but the curious crowds ran and gathered on that shore. The natural response would have been, "Can't I get a little peace and quiet?" But that's not how Jesus responded to the crowd, which was a very large crowd. Mark was obviously not a Baptist preacher. He gives an attendance figure of 5,000, counting just the men. Had Mark been a Baptist pastor, he would have counted the women and children too, as well as any visible sheep or cattle on the hillside, and multiplied that number by 3. Now, this is one of those stories that many of us learned as children from illustrated storybooks, or those of you of my generation might have learned the story by flannel graph. And teachers usually settle on 2 morals to the story. One, that we, like the boys, should give to God whatever is asked. And 2, that when we give to God, our gifts are multiplied. And those are very good lessons, something for us to learn at whatever stage and age in life. But what else might be mined from this event told by all 4 gospel writers that occurred along the Sea of Galilee? My friend Tony Cartledge is a wonderful Bible scholar who writes the Nurturing Faith Bible studies that we publish. And Tony has pointed out that the whole point of this story is that Jesus is the Messiah who provides bread in the wilderness, even as God provided manna for the Israelites. The 12 baskets of leftovers are more than an indication that each disciple returned with a full basket, but they probably symbolize the 12 tribes of Israel, Tony writes. In other words, there is another lesson beyond Jesus' spoken words and actions, in that the one who brought healing in full stomachs as well as full hearts was none other than the promised Messiah. Those are all good lessons, important lessons from this one parable shared by all 4 gospel writers. But I want to point to one more simple but important lesson: that Jesus' reaction to the crowd was a model of inconvenient compassion. You know, sometimes the disciples get beaten up in the telling of this story. We expect them to expect Jesus to do something miraculous, although Jesus didn't always do miracles, and sometimes when he did, he told them not to tell anybody. So the disciples, as we read in verse 15, were being very responsible when they said, "There is nothing here to eat. It's already getting late. Send the crowds away and they can go buy some food in the villages." Now, John's account carries other specifics that are not written by the other gospel writers. According to John, Jesus looked up and saw the large crowd coming toward him, and he said specifically to Philip, "Where can you buy bread for these people to eat?" But John says Jesus asked this only to put Philip to a test. He already knew what he was going to do, and Philip answered him, 8 months' pay would not buy enough bread for everyone to have a bite. Now, perhaps Jesus wanted to see how big a vision his disciples might have. Could they dream just a little bigger? My college friend, Dr. Bill Birch, is pastor of Northside United Methodist Church in Atlanta. And he once said that this passage reminds him that churches need both big dreamers and responsible realists to balance each other out. Bill notes that Philip was mathematically correct in the answer he gave about how much food at what cost would be needed. But what Philip did not factor in was who was asking him the question. It's the Jesus factor. Perhaps there are a couple of things we can learn from Jesus here. One is, don't be so rational that we limit the capacity of God to work within us and in our world in remarkable ways that we cannot imagine. We must factor in the reality that God can do more than we can plan or afford. And a second lesson, what we consider too little to offer, to make a real difference, can go a long way when offered to Jesus. In other words, most of us have more to offer than we believe we do. Dr. Caroline Lewis teaches biblical preaching at Luther Seminary in St. Paul, Minneapolis. And she said of this miracle story, there is a sense that this story sums up discipleship because it is an invitation to action and involvement. Discipleship, she said, is not just about following, but participating. That is so important for us to grasp. For the boy's generosity was met by the disciples' actions that were met by Jesus' multiplying presence. But it was generosity and action that started the process. We are expected to do something other than simply watch and believe. The Christian faith is not a spectator sport, it is participatory. We simply need to participate more, and we need more participants. A few years ago, I wrote a feature story for Nurturing Faith Journal on Ellen Hevelon, who runs a unique art gallery in Chattanooga, Tennessee. She gives art supplies to persons in homeless shelters as well as to victims of domestic violence, persons with mental and physical challenges, disabled military veterans, and political refugees. And she has discovered some really amazing, gifted artists. In fact, she discovered so many that she opened an art gallery to sell their works. She does it this way. She keeps 30% of the sales for overhead, and she gives 60% to the artists. Of course, that leaves a tithe in which she asks the artist to direct that gift to a cause that they choose. For many, it's the very first time they are on the giving rather than the receiving end of generosity. Ellen has learned a lot about homelessness and related issues that are often complex and not easily overcome. She said the most important thing she learned was that relationships are what really matter, and that relationships require compassion and involvement. Ellen's initial investment began with a few colored pencils and blank sheets of paper that she handed out in a homeless shelter. But that investment has been multiplied into an impressive art gallery on the trendy south side of town. And Ellen said it will work anywhere. Think about that. Fish and bread, pencils and paper. It doesn't take much to get started, does it? And compassion over convenience is always the driving force. The word that is usually translated compassion in the Bible, such as in Jesus' telling of the Good Samaritan, has some really interesting roots. It's a very crude kind of definition of a feeling of concern that is so deep that it comes from the intestines or the bowels of a person. So that perhaps the most literal English translation of Jesus' word that we call compassion would be to have a gut-wrenching sense of concern to the point that we take action even at personal cost. Brennan Manning, in his book, A Glimpse of Jesus, tells of 5 women who were in computer sales who went to Chicago for a trade show. Their husbands went along and were to meet them that evening for dinner. However, the sessions ran long and the women were running late, so they raced toward the train station to make it in time for their dinner reservations. And as they rushed into the station to catch the train, they accidentally bumped a small folding table where a boy was selling some apples. And the basket turned over and spilled apples all over the station. The boy was down on his hands and knees trying to gather them under the feet of the stampeding commuters. But the women made it to the train just in time. But at that second before the doors closed, one of the women had this deep feeling in her stomach that something wasn't right. At the last moment, she stepped off the train and said, "I'll catch up with you all later, probably for dessert." And she worked her way against the crowd till she found the boy with the apples. She got down on her knees and began to help him gather them, and she discovered that he was blind, that he was selling the apples to buy some books he wanted. So she helped him sort the bruised apples from the good one, and when everything was back in order, she gave him $20 for his inconvenience and so he could buy some more apples. And she said, "I hope we didn't spoil your day. May God bless you." And as she walked away, she heard him call out inquisitively, "Hey, are you Jesus?" Well, she had been for him that day because she had demonstrated Christ-like, inconvenient compassion. She had seen the need even though others in their haste were distracted. She had had a gut-wrenching sense of deep concern while the others were only envisioning a tasty dinner. And she had acted in an active and responsive way, going against the flow to the obvious needs of others, while their friends were simply relieved to have caught the train. No, we may not be able to turn one small lunch into an all-you-can-eat buffet, but we can be like Jesus in our compassion, even when it's inconvenient. Whatever situation we may face calls us to do that today, tomorrow, the next day. May we be inconveniently compassionate.